Good evening. My friend, welcome back to Bedtime Echo, where history whispers through the dark. And every echo carries the scent of time long gone. Tonight, as the world outside quiets and the last lights of the city fade, I invite you to close your eyes, slow your breath, and step with me into the dim corridors of Westminster Abbey. Beneath its marble floors, beneath the prayers and the choral songs that have risen there for centuries, something lies waiting a secret, so unsettling that even the stone itself seems to tremble. This is not the story of a queen who ruled with grace and glory. It is the story of what was left of her, long after the applause of her reign turned to dust. The story of Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, and the tomb that should never have been opened. It began in February of 1869, on a morning so cold that the air inside the abbey hung heavy with frost. In the half-light of dawn, the echo of pickaxes rang through the ancient walls. Men worked in silence, breaking through stone that had not been touched for centuries. Their torches flickered against the Gothic arches, and every breath of flame made the shadows move, as though the dead themselves were stirring in their sleep. Among them stood Dean Arthur Stanley, a man of faith, un scholar, and yet on that morning he was a trespasser in the kingdom of the dead. He had come searching for the lost tomb of King James I, but what he would find instead would forever change the way the world saw its greatest queen. The records of burials beneath the abbey were old and contradictory, filled with the errors of time and the vanity of kings. Some said James rested near Henry VII's chapel. Others claimed his coffin had been misplaced during renovations, long forgotten. To find him, Stanley would need to open vaults sealed. Since the reign of Elizabeth herself, Queen Victoria had granted him permission, perhaps never imagining that this humble excavation would disturb the most sacred of royal graves. When the first slab of marble was lifted, a gust of air escaped, stale, cold, and carrying with it the faintest scent of something that had once been alive. As the workmen descended, their lanterns revealed a narrow shaft lined with dust, so thick it clung to their skin like ash. Every strike of the pickaxe echoed through the abbey, rising to the vaulted ceiling like a ghostly bell. At last, the stone broke open, and beneath it, they found a space no larger than a room, filled with darkness that had not known light for more than 260 years. Stanley leaned forward with trembling hands, his torch quivering, and what he saw made his breath falter. Two coffins lay stacked one above the other like a macabre offering heavy, silent, and terrible. The top coffin, larger, ornate, and discoloured to a greenish hue, bore a faint inscription: Elizabeth, Regina. Imagine, for a moment, the weight of that realization. The Virgin Queen herself, the woman who once ruled the seas, who defied the Pope, who faced the Armada now lying hidden beneath stone and lead, forgotten by her descendants, pressed upon by the body of her sister, Mary Tudor, the queen she had despised. Elizabeth's coffin rested above Mary's, a grotesque monument to rivalry even in death. The men in that chamber must have felt the air grow colder. They had not merely uncovered a tomb, they had violated a silence older than any living soul. Stanley approached the coffin. The lid had warped over time, sinking inward, forming a faint silhouette of the body within the outline of a queen trapped in her final prison. Carved upon its lid were Tudor roses, a crown, and the faint markings of dates, now almost lost to corrosion. But there was something else, something that did not belong. A name scratched crudely into the metal: John Weir. 1645. No title, no explanation, just a scar upon the coffin's skin. Who was he? A grave robber? A curious monk? A servant of the crown? No one knows. Yet his name remained there. Proof that this tomb had been touched before, that even the greatest of queens could not guard herself from the living. When Stanley lifted his torch, the flickering light caught the surface of the lead and revealed something strange, fine. Silvery trails, where condensation had formed and vanished again, as if the coffin itself had wept. The air grew heavier. A faint sound, perhaps the shifting of gas or the whisper of settling stone, made one of the labourers step back. Stanley recorded the details in his notes with careful restraint, but what he did not write down would speak louder than what he did. For when a lead coffin sealed for centuries is breached, it does not merely release dust, it releases the breath of decay itself, the slow, invisible exhalation of death. Some accounts later whispered that the air was so foul, the men had to step away and cover their mouths, that the stench of corruption filled the vault, thick and oily, the smell of something ancient that should never have been disturbed. The dean, pale but composed, ordered the opening to be sealed again, but curiosity had already done its work. From that moment, Elizabeth's tomb was no longer just a resting place, it was a warning. And here lies the irony of history's greatest queen. In life, Elizabeth ruled through illusion. She turned age into beauty, loneliness into power, and fear into majesty. She wore the mask of the Virgin Queen, untouched, eternal. But in death, that mask melted away. The lead that encased her became her prison. The gases of her own body pressed against the coffin until the metal bulged and cracked, as if even the elements rebelled against the lie of immortality. Beneath the marble grandeur, beneath the hymns and candles, what remained of her was not eternal grace, but flesh, gas, and ruin. Dean Stanley's discovery was meant to be a record of royal history, but it became something far deeper. A mirror reflecting the truth of every empire, every crown, every soul that ever thought itself untouchable. Power ends here, the tomb seemed to whisper. The woman who once stood unshaken before kings was now a shape in lead, a whisper in stone, a scent that lingered too long in the air. And so tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine the stillness beneath Westminster Abbey, the quiet hum of centuries, the soft sigh of dust settling over names carved in gold. Imagine the lead coffin of Elizabeth I, lying heavy above her sister's bones, silent but not forgotten. The marble above may tell of triumphs and conquests, but beneath it, something else endures the faint echo of what time does to us all. For no crown, no legend, no glory can outlive the slow breath of decay. In that darkness, beneath the earth's cold weight, history sleeps and waits to be heard again. And that, my friend, is where our story begins. The story continues from that same silence beneath Westminster Abbey, where time itself seemed to pause after Dean Stanley's trembling torch withdrew from the grave. Above ground, the City of London moved on, unaware that its proudest monarch had just been disturbed from centuries of uneasy rest. But to truly understand the horror beneath that marble floor, we must return to where it all began, to a room in Richmond Palace. On a bleak morning in March of 1603, when the Queen of England refused to die, the chamber was dim, heavy with the scent of sickness and candle wax. Outside, the frost still clung to the branches of the gardens that had once echoed with laughter and lute music. But inside, silence ruled. Elizabeth I had been standing for 15 hours straight, motionless, refusing food, refusing sleep, refusing to be helped into bed. Her ladies-in-waiting watched in terror as their queen, once radiant and commanding, now stood like a ghost in her own body, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. She believed that if she were to lie down, Death would come for her immediately. And perhaps, in some corner of her mind, she already knew that he was waiting there, the one adversary she could not outwit, the shadow that no crown could command. They placed cushions beneath her feet, softening the floor so that when she fell, it would not bruise her skin. And still she stood, unmoving. Her breath came shallow, her hands trembling against the folds of her gown. The same hands that had signed the death warrant of Mary, Queen of Scots. The same hands that had once held the sceptre of an empire upon which the sun dared not set. Now, those hands clutched at the air, as if trying to hold on to a life that had already begun to slip away. In that room, the walls seemed to breathe with her slow, strained, uneasy. Elizabeth Southwell, one of her attendants, would later write that the Queen's eyes had grown so hollow that they seemed to reflect another world, one that none of them dared to enter. And near the end, as she sat on the cushions spread across the floor, someone found a playing card beside her chair. A single card pierced through with a nail, a strange omen, as if some unseen hand had marked her fate. In those final hours, that her mind wandered through visions that blurred the line between dream and delirium, she saw shadows on the walls that no one else could see. I heard whispers in the corners of the room that made her shiver, though the fire still burned. The Virgin Queen, who had ruled through image and illusion, he was now being haunted by the very ghosts she had kept hidden behind her masks. The courtiers who once competed for her smile now stood at a distance, whispering about her decline. She no longer permitted mirrors in her chamber. The sight of her own reflection was unbearable. The lead-white cosmetics that had once given her face its iconic pale radiance had burned her skin, corroding her flesh slowly over decades. Her teeth had blackened and fallen out, her gums receding until even speech became painful, beneath the heavy wig of auburn curls that had once symbolized eternal youth. Her scalp was thin and almost bare. The scent of perfume and rosewater could no longer conceal the truth. The Queen of England was rotting while still alive. On that fourth day, her voice, when it came, was faint and unsteady. "I will not go to bed," she whispered, "for I know that if I rest, I shall never rise again." Her attendants pleaded, wept, begged her to lie down. She would not. Instead, she stood like a broken statue, her eyes turned toward the ceiling, lips moving silently in what might have been prayer, or defiance, or perhaps just exhaustion. For Elizabeth, who had spent her life balancing between power and loneliness, there could be no surrender, not even at the end. To close her eyes would be to admit that she was human after all that time had finally conquered her. When at last her strength gave way, she collapsed gently onto the cushions, and the court fell into chaos. Physicians rushed in, priests whispered litanies, and courtiers wept in corners, all pretending they had not long awaited this moment. For hours she drifted in and out of consciousness, her lips murmuring words no one could understand. Some said she called for her mother, Anna Boleyn, the executed queen whose ghost had always lingered in her life. Others swore she whispered the name of Robert Dudley, the man she had loved and never allowed herself to marry. Perhaps she called for neither. Perhaps for both, or perhaps she called for no one at all, having realized that even love was useless at the edge of eternity. By dawn, her breath grew shallow, her skin turned waxen, and the hand that once signed decrees of war trembled as it searched for something to hold on to. Then, as the first light of day crept into the chamber, the greatest Queen England had ever known simply stopped. No scream, no gasp, no drama, only a faint sigh, as if even in death she wished to control the final moment. It was March 24th, in the year 1603. The reign of Elizabeth I had ended, and the Virgin Queen lay still at last. But even in death, she was not allowed peace. Her chamber was sealed. No one was permitted to examine her body. The official story claimed it was out of respect, to preserve the purity of the Virgin Queen's image. But whispers soon spread through the corridors, whispers that her attendants had forbidden the examination for a different reason, that the Queen's body bore marks of illness, or something worse, something that could shatter the myth she had built so carefully. Was it disease, poison, or perhaps the simple truth of decay that the crown could not permit to be seen? The silence around her death was as thick as the lead that would soon encase her. When they finally lifted her from the floor, her body was so stiff it could barely be moved. The chill of death had already taken hold, and the scent that rose from her skin made even her loyal ladies turn away. They dressed her in royal robes, crimson and gold, with jewels at her throat and a crown placed delicately upon her wig. Her face was painted once more in white and red, the final mask to cover what time had done. Then they sealed her inside a coffin lined with lead, as though to protect her from the world, or perhaps to protect the world from her. The funeral procession began a month later. On the 28th of April, London was shrouded in mourning. From Whitehall to Westminster, thousands gathered to watch the slow march of horses draped in black velvet. The coffin, covered in purple silk and adorned with an effigy of the Queen, rolled through the streets like a moving cathedral of grief. The effigy itself was breathtaking, carved in wood, and painted so lifelike that onlookers gasped and crossed themselves, believing the Queen had risen to attend her own funeral. Her painted eyes seemed to follow the crowd. Her hands, moulded to hold the scepter, seemed ready to lift it again. Men and women wept openly, not just for their queen, but for the passing of an age. For 45 years she had ruled, outlasting conspiracies, assassinations, and wars. Now her lifeless image floated through the city that once trembled at her word. The bells tolled. The sky turned grey. And behind the solemn grandeur of that procession, a truth no one dared to speak lingered like a shadow that beneath the velvet and the hymns, beneath the painted mask and the royal symbols. The Queen was already dissolving. The lead coffin that carried her would soon become both her armour and her curse, trapping her body and her legend in the same eternal silence. When the procession reached Westminster Abbey, the coffin was lowered into a vault that already held her grandfather, Henry VIII. Beneath his vast marble monument, the lead coffin was sealed again, the torches extinguished, and the stone slab replaced above it. No one spoke. For the first time in nearly half a century, the Virgin Queen was alone. The last breath of her reign had faded into the cold air of the Abbey, leaving behind nothing but echoes and the faint smell of extinguished candles. And yet, if you had been there, if you had leaned close to that sealed coffin and listened, you might have heard something strange. A faint sound, soft and low, like the echo of breath caught in metal. Perhaps it was just the sound of cooling air, or perhaps it was something else, the whisper of a spirit that refused to be still, the restless sigh of a queen who had lived too long in the glare of her own legend. For the truth is that Elizabeth did not die quietly. Not in memory, not in spirit, and not in the grave that would hold her for centuries. Her story, even now, continues to breathe beneath the stones of Westminster. Her coffin, heavy and unyielding, became a kind of time capsule, sealing not just her body, but every secret, every fear, every illusion she had carried through life. And one day, century later, when Dean Arthur Stanley opened that tomb, it would all come rushing back: the smell, the silence, the decay, the truth of what power becomes when it meets eternity. But that my friend, is for the next part of our story, when the marble floor cracks open and the dead begin to speak once more. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember this: even queens rot in silence, and no mask can outlast the hand of time. The coffin of Elizabeth I rested in the crypt of Westminster Abbey, sealed within lead and darkness. But even that silence was not meant to last. 3 years after her burial, in the year 1606, England found itself under a new sovereign, James I, the son of the woman Elizabeth had ordered to death. And in that strange twist of divine irony, it was this man, born from the blood, Elizabeth despised, who decided where her body should rest. He commanded that the Queen's coffin be moved from the vault of Henry VIII to another resting place, deeper, quieter, colder, there, in the north aisle of Henry VII's chapel. He placed her atop the coffin of her half-sister, Mary Tudor, the same sister she had defeated, humiliated, and overshadowed in life. Imagine that for a moment. Two women, born of the same father but divided by faith and fire, locked together in eternity. Mary, the Catholic queen who burned heretics to defend the Pope, and Elizabeth, the Protestant virgin who broke England free from Rome's grasp. In life, they could not share the same crown. In death, they were forced to share the same grave. The marble above them told a story of harmony, an elegant fiction carved by order of the king. But beneath that stone, the truth was grim, and the air was thick with centuries of resentment that no prayer could cleanse. Elizabeth's coffin, vast and heavy, weighed down the one below, pressing upon Mary's bones with the slow cruelty of time. King James had commissioned a monument, a beautiful thing, crafted by the sculptor Maximilian Colt and painted by Jean Dretz to show Elizabeth's image in eternal triumph. Her effigy was carved in white marble, crowned and serene, her scepter in hand, her robes flowing like frozen water. The inscription celebrated her long reign, her wisdom, her glory, and her unmatched devotion to her people. But what it did not say, what no mason dared to carve, was that Mary's coffin lay directly beneath, unmarked and unseen, crushed under the same queen who had stolen her throne. The two sisters, one above the other, formed a grotesque double tomb, Elizabeth displayed like a goddess, and Mary hidden like a secret that refused to rest. The official records claimed that this arrangement was symbolic: two queens, united in faith and blood, their rivalry finally silenced. Yet anyone who knew their story understood that there could be no peace between them. Elizabeth had lived her life, haunted by her sister's shadow. It was Mary who once had her imprisoned, who had nearly sent her to the scaffold, who had taught her what it meant to live surrounded by fear. And when the wheel of fate turned, Elizabeth returned the favor she outlived Mary, erased her memory, and rewrote the history of England in her own image. Now, in death, her coffin lay above Mary's as if to prove that even the grave could not overturn her victory. But the irony of fate is merciless. The same lead coffin that symbolized Elizabeth's triumph would, in time, to become her own punishment. For centuries, the two coffins lay undisturbed beneath the abbey's stone floor. The monks, the kings, the priests who walked above them came and went, and the world forgot the details of what had been done there. The marble monument remained, dazzling and perfect, telling the story of unity that never existed. Yet beneath it, something was happening in the dark, something slow, quiet, and irreversible. The weight of Elizabeth's lead coffin pressed downward, year after year, until the wood and bone below began to collapse. The lead, thick and unyielding, trapped air and moisture within, turning the inside of her tomb into a sealed furnace of decay. Over the centuries, as seasons changed and the abbey breathed through its ancient stones, condensation crept across the lead, dripping down like cold tears onto Mary's coffin below. The queen who had ruled over nations was slowly melting into her sister's grave. By the 18th century, scholars and church wardens who studied the abbey's records began to notice inconsistencies. There were too many royal burials, too many names, too many missing vaults. They suspected that the remains of Elizabeth, Mary, and perhaps even James had all been moved and stacked in ways no one truly understood. But no one dared to dig. The abbey was sacred ground, and the memory of the Virgin Queen was untouchable. To disturb her was to disturb England itself. So they left her there, sleeping above her sister, unaware that what lay between them was no longer marble and silence, but rot and the slow sigh of time eating through metal. Yet history is never content to let the dead rest. In the year 1869, when Dean Arthur Stanley began his excavation to locate the missing tomb of King James, he unknowingly approached the resting place of the two sisters. His intent had been purely academic, a survey, a matter of record, a small act of restoration to correct the errors of history. But history does not forgive curiosity. As his men chipped away at the stone, the ground trembled faintly, and a foul odor seeped through the cracks, not the scent of soil or age, but something deeper, older, the smell of sealed death. When the final slab lifted, the vault revealed its secret: 2 lead coffins, stacked, just as James had ordered 2.5 centuries earlier. In that narrow chamber, lit only by flickering torches, the workers saw the strange green shimmer of corrosion spreading across the metal. The larger coffin, Elizabeth's, lay above the smaller one, its surface warped and sagging as though the Queen's body had melted against the lead from within. And below, the coffin of Mary dented, crushed slightly inward, her name long since faded from any inscription. The air was still, heavy, and poisonous. Stanley himself later wrote that it was an atmosphere untouched since the day they were sealed. A sentence that hides more horror than it reveals. No one spoke. The torches hissed and smoked. Somewhere above them, the abbey bells rang faintly for evening prayer, their sound muffled by tons of stone. And in that moment, surrounded by dust and royal decay, Stanley understood the cruel poetry of what lay before him: 2 queens, enemies in life, condemned to an eternal embrace. Neither could escape. Elizabeth, who had once towered above her sister, was now pressing down upon her with the weight of her own corruption. Mary, the queen who had sought redemption through fire, now endured it beneath the slow, crushing burn of lead and time. It is said that when the coffin shifted slightly under the pressure, one of the workmen gasped and crossed himself. The dean, pale but composed, ordered the chamber sealed again. He took careful notes, sketched the layout, and recorded every symbol he could see: the Tudor rose, the faint crown, the markings that proved beyond doubt that this was indeed Elizabeth's tomb. But he omitted one detail from the official report: the smell. For when the coffin of the Virgin Queen was exposed to the air, it released a breath that made the torches flicker, and the men stepped back in revulsion. It was the stench of centuries, of flesh turned to vapor, of time reclaiming what it was owed. When Stanley's account was later published, the public read it as a tale of discovery, of royal history restored. But those who had been there remembered something else: the quiet horror of standing in the presence of death's persistence. The sight of 2 coffins locked together in a grotesque dance of decay. Elizabeth's coffin, larger and heavier, bore the shape of her body, the lead molded to her outline like a ghostly impression. It was as though she were still there, straining against the metal, her defiance frozen even in death. And beneath her, Mary's remains lay flattened into near silence, her story crushed beneath the weight of her sister's myth. In that darkness, the line between history and haunting blurred. The vault had become a theatre where time performed its cruelest play. The marble monument above spoke of unity, grace, and divine order, but below it, the truth lay twisted and silent. Two queens, one consuming the other, both slowly dissolving into the same black dust. And perhaps that is how all power ends. Not in triumph, not in memory, but in the quiet merging of bone and shadow. When the vault was resealed, the abbey returned to its calm. Tourists and mourners continued to pass through the chapel, stopping to admire the beauty of Elizabeth's effigy, unaware that beneath their feet, the remains of two royal sisters were still entwined in an eternal struggle. The incense burned, the hymns rose, and the centuries rolled on. Yet the air above that spot, even now, seems different, a little colder, a little heavier, as if the stones remember what they were made to hide. And so the story deepens, descending further into the vaults of history, where faith and flesh decay together. Elizabeth's triumph had always been built upon illusion, but now the illusion was complete above ground. Her marble image remained radiant and immortal, while below, her true self continued to rot in secret. The Virgin Queen who had conquered empires and mastered deception could not deceive death. Beneath her, the sister she once despised held her up, or perhaps, in some strange justice, dragged her slowly downward. That is where we leave them for tonight. Two queens bound in darkness, the sound of London faintly humming above, the stones sweating with centuries of secrets. The world will go on believing in the legend, in the painted face and the perfect crown. But somewhere beneath the marble floor, time whispers a different truth, one that no monument can silence. In the Abbey's endless night, the sisters still sleep, or perhaps they never truly have. The Abbey never truly sleeps. Even when the candles fade and the tourists are gone, even when the last footstep disappears beneath the echo of the choir, the stones remember. They breathe faintly in the cold, exhaling centuries of secrets through their cracks. Beneath those stones, deep in the airless dark, Elizabeth and Mary lie together, one pressed upon the other, one conquering still, one enduring still. Yet their story does not end there, for in that strange stillness, long after their flesh had turned to shadow, history found new hands willing to disturb them again. It was February of 1869 when Dean Arthur Stanley descended once more into the vault of Henry VII's chapel, carrying with him sketches, records, and a torch that flickered against the damp. He had been tasked not with curiosity, but with order to find the lost resting place of King James I, whose burial had become confused among the labyrinth of royal tombs. But fate, as always, favours irony. The man searching for the son would instead uncover the mother's greatest secret, the one her marble monument had hidden for centuries. The work began before dawn. The abbey was silent, but for the sound of chisels striking stone, rhythmic and slow, like a heartbeat deep underground. Dust rose from the cracks as the men pried up the slabs, and with each inch of progress, the air grew colder. Stanley himself knelt beside the opening, his breath visible in the torchlight. He wrote later that the silence below was older than any sound of man. When the final block shifted aside, a rush of foul air escaped, stale as forgotten time. It brushed his face like a sigh, and he knew, at once, that he had broken something sacred. What his lantern revealed was not the royal order he had expected, but a small, cramped chamber filled with the remains of England's most powerful dead. Two lead coffins lay stacked directly atop each other, their shapes distorted by pressure and corrosion. The upper coffin, larger, bore the faint marks of a crown, and the Tudor rose unmistakable symbols of Elizabeth I. The lower coffin, darker and slightly crushed inward, belonged to Mary Tudor, her rival and her blood. The sight was both magnificent and grotesque. The final portrait of two queens locked in a union neither heaven nor earth had intended. Stanley's assistants hesitated to approach. The vault's air was thick, as though the centuries themselves had congealed into a living thing. Every movement stirred a faint whisper, the rustle of cloth disintegrating, the crackle of decayed wood. The Dean pressed forward, studying the coffins with scholarly precision. But inside, he felt an unease that no reason could quiet. The lead, he noticed, had taken on a greenish hue, like the skin of something left too long in the dark. Beads of moisture clung to its surface, sliding down like tears. Then he saw it an inscription, crudely carved, nearly lost to oxidation. It bore not the grace of a craftsman, but the impatient hand of a man who had no right to be there. John Weir, 1645. The name scratched into the coffin's flank like a wound. Stanley stared at it in disbelief. Who was this? John Weir. No records mentioned him. No permission had been given to enter the vault in that year. Had he been a worker, a thief, a soldier, or merely a man drawn, as all men are, to the forbidden mystery of death? Whatever his story, his mark had endured when even royal inscriptions faded. The Queen's name was dim, but his was sharp and defiant. History, it seemed, belonged as much to the intruders as to the dead. The Dean's notes described the moment of discovery with restraint, almost politeness. But others, years later, whispered what he left, unsaid that the stench rising from that vault was unbearable, that the lead coffins hissed softly when touched, releasing the trapped breath of centuries. In life, Elizabeth had been surrounded by perfumes of amber and rose. In death, she exhaled only decay. The gases of her own decomposition had swelled against the metal for 260 years, turning the coffin into a bloated tomb within a tomb. When Stanley's men shifted their lamps, the heat caused the lead to creak, and for an instant, someone thought they heard movement from within. No one dared to open it. The Dean understood that curiosity had limits, that beyond a certain threshold, the pursuit of knowledge becomes desecration. He sketched, he measured, he recorded, but he did not disturb. Yet still, the vault disturbed him. For the more he studied, the more he realized how wrong the arrangement was. Elizabeth's coffin had been made larger, heavier, and more ornate than most royal burials, as if to proclaim her supremacy even underground. Mary's coffin, smaller and simpler, was buried beneath like an afterthought. But the weight of the upper coffin had warped the lower one. The lead sagged inward where it pressed against the sisters' bones. In that dim light, the scene seemed less like rest and more like punishment. Two women forever caught in the pose of power and submission. Stanley returned above ground, pale and shaken, his face lined with dust and awe. He spoke little of what he had seen. The official report, later presented to Queen Victoria, was polite and measured, filled with careful phrases about historic integrity and architectural interest. But between those words, an unspoken truth lingered that the Virgin Queen had not aged well beneath her marble crown. Her once glorious effigy above, carved in smooth white stone, bore no resemblance to what lay below. Above, she appeared eternal. Below, she had become the very image of mortality. The Victorian world, obsessed with moral order and propriety, received Stanley's report with fascination. Newspapers published engravings of the tomb, romanticizing the discovery as if it were a tale of reverence. Yet those who read closely could sense the darkness between the lines. He wrote that the upper coffin was of human form, a phrase that seemed innocent, until one realized what it meant. The lead had taken the exact shape of Elizabeth's body, molded by centuries of slow pressure. Her limbs, her face, her very silhouette were pressed into the coffin's skin, fossilized in metal. The body of the Queen had become its own monument, a sculpture of corruption crafted by time, but even that grotesque poetry could not conceal the deeper tragedy. For what Stanley had uncovered was not merely the decay of a single woman, but the slow collapse of a myth, the myth of divine royalty, of untouchable power, of perfection that could outlast the grave. Elizabeth's body was no different from any other. The same gases that swelled inside her coffin had once filled the vaults of lesser men and nameless paupers. Her royal blood, preserved by ceremony and fear, had turned to the same black liquid that had pooled beneath kings before her. The Virgin Queen, who had vowed never to bow to any man, now lay conquered by chemistry and time. When Stanley resealed the vault, he left behind a small plaque marking the discovery. The abbey resumed its quiet, and for a while, it seemed as though the dead would finally rest. But nothing in that place is ever truly at peace. Over the decades that followed, rumours persisted among the vergers and caretakers, whispers of strange sounds in the night, faint sighs from beneath the floor, an odour that came and went with the changes in weather. Some said it was imagination. Others said it was air shifting through cracks in the stone. Yet those who worked in the abbey long enough came to know the truth. The tomb breathes, not with life, but with memory. Sometimes, when the moonlight slips through the stained glass and spills across the marble effigies, the carvings seem almost to move. Elizabeth's face, serene and proud, appears to flicker a trick of shadow, perhaps, or something older, the echo of her vanity still shimmering in the stone. And if you stand very still, you might almost hear the faintest echo rising from below, a soft creak of lead, the sigh of metal collapsing under its own age, the slow music of two queens still bound together in death. That is the nature of history. We like to think it sleeps quietly beneath its monuments, neat and contained, sealed away from the living. But history, like the dead, does not rest. It seeps upward through the cracks, through the stories we tell and the lies we carve in marble. Above the ground, Elizabeth still rules in beauty, her tomb shining white, her crown untouched by dust. Below, her coffin continues to warp, her flesh long gone, her name still breathing faintly through the stench of lead and time. The Virgin Queen remains undefeated in the eyes of the world. Yet in the silence of her grave, she is lost to the one power she could never conquer. And perhaps that is why, even now, as night deepens and the abbey stands still under the weight of centuries, her story refuses to die. The stone above her speaks of majesty and triumph, but the darkness below whispers a different truth, that power decays, beauty fades, and even queens turn to dust. The marble remembers the illusion, the lead remembers the flesh. Between them lies everything that was ever human about Elizabeth Tudor, her pride, her fear, to her loneliness, her desperate refusal to rest. So when you walk the aisles of Westminster Abbey someday, and your steps echo softly across the floor, pause for a moment by her monument. Look up at the white marble figure of the Queen who defied the world. Then close your eyes and listen. Beneath that carved serenity lies a different voice. Fin but éternel, murmuring through the stone. It is not the voice of power, nor of glory. It is the quiet, trembling breath of time itself, whispering that nothing not crowns, not beauty, not even the Virgin Queen can escape the long decay of history. Night thickened over London as the Abbey's bells ceased their tolling, and once again, the great church sank into its timeless hush. Outside, fog rolled across the Thames like smoke from an unseen fire, curling around the spires and the statues, swallowing sound, blurring light, turning the city into a dream. Yet beneath those stones, beneath the carved angels and the silent kings, the story of Elizabeth was not finished. For the tomb that held her, the one that Dean Arthur Stanley had dared to open in that fateful February of 1869, was not merely a chamber of death, it was a vault of memory, of corruption, of the living curiosity that forever defiles the stillness of the grave. The discovery had changed him. Those who saw him afterwards said that his eyes seemed to carry the weight of what he had seen. The Dean had entered the tomb of a legend, and what he found there was not divinity, not peace, but the relentless proof that even the greatest of queens could rot like any other mortal thing. Yet, to understand the horror of what he found, one must look not only at the coffins themselves, but at the substance of their decay, the hidden science of death sealed inside lead coffins, long favoured by royalty, were thought to preserve the body by shutting out air, moisture, and vermin. But the truth was far more grotesque. Within their airtight walls, the very chemistry of death transformed into something monstrous. As the body broke down, it released gases: methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, all trapped within the heavy casing, building pressure over decades. In wooden coffins, these vapors seeped away into the earth, but in lead they swelled silently, turning the tomb into a swelling cauldron of rot. Flesh liquefied, organs melted into a tar-like fluid, bones softened, the air inside thickened into a deadly corrosive mist. And when the seal was finally broken, after centuries, that imprisoned breath of the dead rushed out like a ghost, invisible but suffocating, foul enough to make the living stagger back in disgust. It was said that when Stanley's men cracked the vault, they did not hear silence, but a faint hiss, as though something long trapped had exhaled in relief. A whisper of gases, thick with the scent of old flesh, slipped past their lamps, wrapping itself around them like unseen fingers. For a moment no one spoke. Then one man muttered a prayer. In that darkness, surrounded by decay, even faith wavered. For centuries, people had knelt before Elizabeth's marble effigy, whispering prayers to the Queen who had defied Spain, silenced her enemies, and kept her virgin vow to God. Yet here, beneath their feet, her mortal remains told another story, one of dissolution, corruption, and chemical vengeance. The woman who had commanded nations now ruled only over rot and gas. It was not just Elizabeth. Every royal sealed within the Abbey shared that fate. Beneath the glittering memorials of saints and sovereigns lay a secret kingdom of ruin. Edward IV, when his tomb at Windsor was opened, was found half dissolved, his lower limbs floating in inches of black liquid, the final broth of decomposition. Henry VIII's coffin, when disturbed, emitted a smell so revolting that witnesses wrote of nausea and fainting. Even kings who had once worn golden crowns were reduced to the same rank mixture of fluids and gases. But Elizabeth's case was singular, because her coffin's immense weight and perfect seal had turned it into a pressure vessel, a dark crucible where flesh and spirit were fused into something unspeakable. It was said that if her coffin had ever burst, as some claimed others once did, the abbey itself might have filled with a vapor strong enough to choke the priests at prayer. Dean Stanley never confirmed such tales, but his notes are curiously silent on what became of the air inside that vault. Perhaps he feared the public would turn horror into spectacle. The Victorians, after all, had an appetite for the macabre. They collected mummies, displayed skeletons, and turned death into art. To them, the grave was not sacred. It was a curiosity, a cabinet of wonders. And so it was that news of Stanley's discovery spread quietly at first, then widely, until the people of London spoke of the two queens beneath the abbey as if it were a ghost story meant for cold evenings. Some claimed that strange odours had risen from the floor near the chapel, especially in summer, when the heat awakened what slept below. Others swore that the marble effigy of Elizabeth glowed faintly at night, its white surface pulsing with a breath of its own. The abbey denied such nonsense. Of course, but rumours are not so easily buried. Visitors began to linger longer before the monument, staring at the carved serenity of the Queen's face, wondering what truly lay below. The more they admired the purity of her marble image, the more grotesque the truth became. For every inch of perfection above ground was balanced by corruption beneath. The effigy was smooth, untouched, ageless while below. Her coffin wept moisture, the lead sweating under centuries of strain, the metal bending as if breathing. The very contrast became an unspoken metaphor for monarchy itself, beauty and rot, sanctity and sin, illusion and truth. As years passed, the abbey's guardians began to understand that the vault beneath them was more fragile than they had believed. The lead coffins were aging, softening, pressing down upon one another. Moisture crept in through microscopic cracks. The marble floor above showed faint irregularities, as though something below was sinking. Maintenance crews reported a subtle odor, metallic and faint, like rust mixed with mildew. No one dared to open the vault again, but everyone who worked there knew that something was happening beneath. Some nights, when the abbey was closed, the vergers walking their rounds swore they heard a low sound. Not quite a creak, not quite a sigh, the whisper of lead settling deeper into dust. By then, Elizabeth's legend had grown even larger. Historians painted her as the embodiment of an age-wise, brave, eternal. Plays, novels, and portraits glorified her as England's golden goddess. Yet each time her story was told, the real queen, the one of flesh and floor, vanished a little more. The woman who had once wept alone for Robert Dudley, who had struck her servants in fits of rage, who had feared mirrors and the creeping hands of age, she was buried twice, once in her coffin, and again beneath centuries of adoration. Her tomb, like her reign, was a performance, a masterpiece of control. But death, unlike history, cannot be edited. It is honest, brutally honest. And there, in that honesty, lies the reason why her tomb remains the most haunting in all of England. For beneath the beauty of Westminster's marble corridors lies a truth that no one can escape, that every monument is a lie. Every statue, a mask. Every grave, a stage where the living perform their reverence while pretending not to smell the decay. The abbey itself, so full of hymns and incense, is also full of bodies that have long ceased to be anything but dust and gas. When the choirs sing and the candles flicker, their light dances across invisible clouds of ancient air, the same air once trapped in lead and bone. And somewhere among those unseen particles drifts a fragment of Elizabeth herself, carried upward through cracks and stone, whispering still. It is said that one winter evening, decades after Stanley's exploration, a caretaker working late in the chapel saw a strange shimmer near the floor. He thought it a trick of the lamplight until he smelled it faint at first, then stronger. A scent of iron and something sweetly rancid, like flowers left too long in water. He froze, the lamp trembling in his hand. Then, very softly, he heard what he swore was the sound of cloth dragging against stone, a long, slow rustle, as if someone below had turned in their sleep. When he spoke of it later, no one believed him. But the man never returned to that part of the abbey again. He said the smell lingered in his clothes for weeks, and when he washed his hands, the scent rose from his skin as if it lived there. Perhaps it was imagination. Perhaps the residue of lead and damp. Or perhaps something else, the restless echo of a queen who, even in death, could not bear to be forgotten. For Elizabeth's reign had been built on image, and image survives, even when the body fails. Above her, the carved marble still smiles serenely, lit by soft lamplight and the devotion of pilgrims. But below, her coffin continues to sink, her sister's crushed tomb still bearing the weight. And between those two, between the illusion and the reality, lies the essence of her story, that no power, however absolute, can silence the slow decay of truth. When Dean Stanley resealed the vault that day, he sealed more than a coffin. He sealed the proof that every myth eventually leaks through stone, through lead, through memory itself. The abbey would go on shining. The bells would keep their rhythm, and London would forget. But sometimes, on cold February mornings when fog clings to the ground and the sound of the river hums like breath, one might stand in that sacred place and feel it, a faint vibration beneath the soles, a pulse in the stone, the murmuring of something that refuses to rest. Elizabeth's tomb is not a monument to peace. It is a mirror. When we gaze upon her marble face, we are not looking at the queen who once lived, but at ourselves, at our hunger to believe that greatness can outlast decay, that beauty can escape the grave. But if you listen closely, the abbey itself tells a different story. Beneath the hymns, beneath the footsteps of kings and mourners, beneath the centuries of dust and reverence, the earth is still whispering its quiet, merciless truth that all flesh turns to gas, all crowns turn to rust, and that even in lead, even beneath marble, even after 400 years, the Virgin Queen breathes her last again and again. Each time someone dares to remember her, the abbey stands eternal, yet nothing within it truly sleeps. Beneath its echoing vaults, the air tastes faintly of wax, old prayers, and something older still, the scent of centuries folded into stone. Tourists who wander through in daylight never sense it. They see only the marble glow, the filtered sunlight, the noble silence. But those who have been there at dusk, when the last hymn fades and the torches dim, speak of a heaviness that settles upon the floor, as though the earth itself remembers what lies buried below. And it is in that twilight stillness that the truth of Elizabeth's tomb becomes something more than history. It becomes revelation, a warning written not in ink but in rot, not in words but in the slow decay of metal and memory. The years after Dean Stanley's discovery were quiet on the surface, but beneath the marble calm, the vault continued to change. Lead, though heavy and steadfast, is soft. Time eats it like acid, bending it inward, causing it to sag around whatever it was meant to protect. Inside the coffin of Elizabeth I, what remained of her body pressed against the walls that held it, moulding them like clay. The shape of her head, her shoulders, her folded hands began to show faintly through the metal, as if she was still trying to rise, still trying to remind the world that she was once more than dust. Beneath her, the coffin of Mary Tudor continued to sink, crushed further by the relentless weight above it. The two sisters, forced into eternal contact, became one form of decay, the upper coffin settling into the lower, the lead groaning faintly when the ground shifted with the rhythm of the city above. Sometimes, late in winter, the Abbey's caretakers said they heard strange sounds under the floor near the chapel, soft thuds like distant heartbeats, the sigh of metal moving in the cold. They said it was the coffins adjusting, bending under centuries of strain. But others whispered that it was something else, that the queens themselves, disturbed too often by human hands, had learned to move again in small ways, like the memory of breath still trapped in dead lungs. Of course, no one dared to believe such tales. The Abbey belonged to faith, not superstition. And yet, when the nights grew damp and the wind howled through the arches, even the priests avoided walking over that section of stone alone. By the late 19th century, the fascination with royal remains had become a fever. The Victorians, with their hunger for both science and spectacle, could not resist the temptation to peer into the graves of their heroes. They opened tombs and measured bones, examined teeth and hair, as if the secrets of greatness could be weighed on a scale. They pried open the coffins of kings, the vaults of poets, the shrines of saints, and always they found the same thing, the ruin beneath the glory. Yet none drew as much silent terror as the tale of Elizabeth's leaden sarcophagus, for it was said to have retained its human shape more perfectly than any other. Scholars whispered that the air inside was poisonous, the fluids corrosive, and that no one could ever open it without releasing death itself into the living world. A strange reverence grew around her tomb, not the reverence of prayer, but the awe one feels before a volcano that might wake again. Writers called her the sleeping monarch of poison, and poets imagined her ghost walking through the abbey, her crown dripping with black oil, her robes melting into mist. Painters tried to capture the contrast between the marble purity above and the corroded horror below the eternal queen and the mortal woman, split by stone and time. It was as if England itself needed her to remain unbroken, untouched, so that the illusion of its golden age might survive. But the truth beneath the floor refused to keep still. The Abbey's engineers began to notice fine hairline cracks around the vault, lines so thin they were almost invisible, but enough to reveal that the earth was shifting. They patched the stone and sealed the seams, but no plaster could bind eternity. The slow chemistry of decay continued in silence, patient as fate. Meanwhile, the world above changed. Empires rose and fell. Machines replaced horses. The smoke of new wars blackened the London sky. And through it all, Elizabeth lay below, her lead coffin breathing faintly with temperature and pressure, her tomb inhaling the exhalations of history. The sound of bombs during the wars echoed through the abbey like thunder over graves. But the vault endured. The Queen's coffin, forged in the 16th century, survived what her palaces and portraits could not. And yet, it was not immortality. It was entombed defiance, the body refusing to vanish, the metal refusing to let go. When restoration work was undertaken in the mid-20th century, curators debated whether to examine the vault again. They feared what they might find: the collapse of the lower coffin, the corrosion of the lead, the possible fusion of both queens into one unholy relic. Some believed the tomb should remain sealed forever. Others argued that science must know the truth. But the Abbey's silence prevailed. No one disturbed the vault again. The memory of Stanley's discovery, of the foul air and the strange hush that followed, was enough to keep even the boldest historians at bay. And so Elizabeth remained, unseen, untouched, still reigning in her silent kingdom of dust. Yet time itself became her final sculptor. The pressure within the coffin, unable to escape, began to create minute fissures. Moisture seeped in, mixing with what was left of her body lead oxide. Bone, remnants of silk, fragments of royal cloth, the powder of jewels once sewn into her gown, all of it turned into a kind of mineral mud that slowly hardened again. Like the sediment of a river after a flood, the queen, who had once feared lying down, had become part of the very earth she had dreaded. Her coffin, once a symbol of power, it was now a geology of decay, a queen transmuted into element and echo. Above her, the effigy continued to gleam in the light. Tourists came and whispered. She ruled for 45 years. As if saying the number aloud could summon her spirit. Children looked up at the crown and smiled. Lovers took photographs in the same aisle, where the air still held traces of her. But none of them knew what they stood upon: a story of corrosion and pride. A queen who had refused to be human until the grave made her so. The marble told one version of her reign, the lead another. The marble said, "She is eternal." The lead whispered, "She is gone." There is a moment, if you stand by her monument in the quiet between evening and night, when the abbey's echoes seem to change. The sound of footsteps fades, and something else begins a deeper resonance, like breathing through stone. It feels as though the abbey itself is remembering her, drawing her story upward from the ground, retelling it through the creak of its beams and the sigh of its arches. The air thickens, heavy with the weight of 4 centuries, and if you listen carefully, you might almost hear the faint rustle of silk, the drag of a sleeve, the whisper of a voice, too proud to rest. Perhaps it is imagination, or perhaps it is something far older, the stubborn will of a queen who built her legend so powerfully that even death cannot quite erase it. And yet, beneath all that defiance, there is tragedy. For Elizabeth's tomb, more than any in England, is a portrait of loneliness. She chose to rule alone, to die alone, to be remembered as something beyond woman, beyond wife, beyond mother. But in the end, she was buried not in solitude, but in suffocating company with the sister she had feared and resented, with the body she had destroyed, the Virgin Queen, who had denied all human bonds, found her eternity, bound by the flesh she sought to escape. There is something poetic in that, something cruel and perfect. Perhaps the universe has a sense of symmetry after all. As centuries pass, her lead coffin will continue to sink, inch by inch, into the dark soil of the abbey floor. The cracks will widen, the marble will one day fracture, and when the day finally comes, whether through accident, earthquake, or the unending curiosity of mankind, the tomb will open again. What they find then will not be a queen or even a skeleton, but a residue of time itself, lead dust, the faint trace of bone, the ghost of a crown pressed into corrosion. And perhaps, if air still stirs within that chamber, it will carry the last echo of her voice, whispering through the centuries the one truth her reign could never accept, that nothing endures, not even the illusion of immortality. Until that day, the abbey stands watch. Above, the choir sings of faith and resurrection. Below, the queens decay together in silence. It is the perfect English irony, beauty built upon rot, empire built upon memory. And so, the legend continues. Tourists come, scholars write, candle burn, prayers rise, and beneath it all, the lead breathes faintly. The metal sighs. The sisters sleep unholy, inseparably, Eternal. There are nights in Westminster Abbey when the air feels different, heavier, more deliberate, as if time itself has thickened. The candles flicker though no wind stirs, and the stone seems to hum with something almost alive. On those nights, the past breathes. It exhales through the seams of the marble, through the cracks of the lead, through the silence between the prayers. The abbey is not a tomb, it is a lung of memory, inhaling reverence, exhaling secrets. And at the heart of that breathing lies the leaden coffin of Elizabeth I, the woman who once ruled the world and now rules only over her own decay. Generations have passed since Dean Arthur Stanley sealed her tomb once more. But the story of what lies beneath never truly vanished. It whispered from scholar to scholar, from verger to verger, from curious visitor to sleepless dreamer. The abbey kept its silence in public. Yet within its cloisters, those who worked closest to the stones would speak quietly of strange happenings. They said that in the small hours before dawn, when the church is empty and only the watchmen remain, the floor near the chapel of Henry VII grows strangely cold, and faint sounds echo beneath it, not the creak of settling stone, not the hum of pipes, but something more deliberate, something that resembles the faint scrape of movement. No one dares to linger when it comes. They whisper that it is the Queen turning in her coffin, trying, even after 4 centuries, to find a position of rest that eluded her in life. But the truth, if one strips away the superstition, is no less haunting. For the abbey itself is changing. The passage of time, the weight of footsteps, the vibration of voices, the slow erosion of moisture through stone, all of it conspires to disturb what was meant to be eternal. The marble above Elizabeth's tomb, though still smooth and shining, has begun to bear hairline fissures, invisible to the casual eye. The air beneath, once dry and still, has grown damp with condensation. The lead coffins below have begun to bend under their own weight, their surfaces rippling like skin. And so, the 2 queens continue to sink, Elizabeth pressing further into Mary, the sisters collapsing into one another like layers of memory. Engineers from the abbey, when they conduct their quiet inspections, note these changes with technical precision, but seldom speak of what they feel. They record measurements of temperature, humidity, structural pressure. They draw diagrams showing the stress lines in the stone. But the language of science cannot quite capture what happens there. Because beneath the instruments, beneath the data, lies the sense that something inhuman, or perhaps all too human, lingers. The abbey, in its solemn way, feels almost alive, as though the dead within it have become its organs. The kings are its bones, the queens its breath, the saints its bloodstream, Elizabeth herself, encased in her thick coffin of lead, might be its heart cold, black, but pulsing still in a rhythm, too slow for living ears to hear. What makes her story different is not the decay itself, but the way she mastered it. Even in death, she remains the architect of illusion. Above ground, her image endures in 1,000 portraits, the flawless white skin, the painted eyes, the jeweled gowns, the steady gaze that never blinks. Below ground, her body has become its own metaphor, stripped of beauty, stripped of legend, returning inch by inch to the elements she once believed she ruled. And in that contrast lies her truest legacy. Every inch of the abbey tells the tale of what time does to glory. The stone that seems eternal is slowly dissolving. The air that smells of incense also smells, faintly, of rust. The marble kings and queens, frozen in postures of power, are quietly surrendering to dust. Yet the story of Elizabeth's tomb outshines them all because it is not only about death, it is about denial. It is about the illusion that even death itself could be commanded. For centuries, poets have written of her as a creature beyond nature, the Virgin Queen, the Moon of England, untouched, unbroken, divine. But beneath that alabaster image was always something trembling. She feared mirrors, refused doctors, hid her illness until it devoured her. She feared the sight of her own mortality more than she ever feared Spain, or Rome, or betrayal. And so, her final resting place reflects that fear perfectly. Her coffin is not one of release, but of containment sealed, suffocating, repressing every trace of what she had been. It is a physical echo of her soul proud, isolated, brilliant, and trapped. The Victorians, who revered her as both saint and symbol, could never have understood the full cruelty of her burial. To them, the lead coffin was a mark of respect, an armor against corruption. But in truth, it was a prison. For lead does not breathe. It does not yield. It traps everything within, not just the body, but the heat, the gas, the memory of motion. It is said that when a sealed lead coffin is disturbed, it sometimes emits a faint sigh, a whisper of the gases inside escaping after centuries. And perhaps that is why the Abbey's watchmen hear those sounds at night, not ghosts, not miracles, but chemistry, the slow alchemy of rot and time. Yet even that explanation feels incomplete. For there are moments when the Abbey's silence seems to tremble with a presence that cannot be measured in molecules. In her life, Elizabeth had always been a paradox, both flesh and symbol, woman and myth, light and darkness intertwined, and so it continues in death. Above her, the marble monument remains untouched, gleaming white under the flickering lamps, her face carved in eternal serenity, her hands folded in perfect composure. But below that false calm, her coffin has changed color again. The greenish film of corrosion has darkened to almost black. The Tudor roses etched into its surface have blurred, eaten away by centuries of damp. If one could see it now, one might think it looked less like a royal casket and more like a charred relic of a shipwreck, something salvaged from the bottom of the sea. And perhaps that is what it is. A sunken relic of empire, a drowned queen resting in her ocean of lead. Scholars who study her legacy often say that Elizabeth's reign marked the dawn of modern England, the age of exploration. Literature, power, yet it is her grave, not her crown, that feels most prophetic. Because her tomb tells a story that belongs to everyone, the futility of control, the vanity of permanence. The same lead that once promised to preserve her now consumes her. The same abbey that glorifies her name also buries her truth. And perhaps that is why her story still calls to us, why we keep opening her vault in imagination, even if we never dare to open it again. She represents the part of us that cannot accept the end, that still believes the right mask, the right monument, the right prayer can outwit decay. And so the Abbey remains both cathedral and confession. By day, the sunlight through the stained glass paints the marble figures in halos of blue and red, making saints out of stone. By night, when all candles are extinguished, those same figures look different, pale, watchful, their faces hollowed by shadow. Somewhere between the two lies the truth, shimmering like a mirage. For all the Abbey's majesty, it is not heaven but a museum of bodies, and every one of them, from king to poet, from warrior to queen, is quietly dissolving. The illusion of eternity has its own kind of rot, and it smells faintly of incense, dust, and lead. And if you stand very still, you may notice how the Abbey hums with two kinds of song, The first is the one you hear the organ's sigh, the soft shuffle of pilgrims, the whisper of Latin prayers rising into the vaults. The second is the one you feel the subsonic murmur of the earth beneath, the vibration of centuries folding over themselves, the faint rhythm of bones and metal and time blending into one continuous note. It is in that sound that Elizabeth's story lives on. She no longer speaks through words or decrees, but through the resonance of her own disintegration. She has become part of the Abbey's frequency, her name absorbed into the pulse of the stone. There will come a day when the Abbey's keepers, out of necessity or curiosity, will open her vault once more. They will find not a queen, but an artifact, fragments of lead, traces of bone, perhaps the faint shimmer of cloth turned to mineral dust. Yet even then, she will not be gone. Her story has fused too completely with the place that holds her, every echo of a footstep, every prayer that floats upward through the nave, passes through the air she left behind. She is not resting. She is resonating, and maybe that is what she always wanted, to be remembered not as a body, but as a force, a voice that lingers, a presence that does not fade. In life, she shaped her image until it transcended the human. In death, she achieved it. For even now, as the Abbey exhales the breath of centuries, somewhere in that slow, steady rhythm, you can hear her faint but clear the rustle of silk, the command of a heartbeat that refuses to stop, the echo of a queen who still believes she can outlast the grave, and perhaps, in a way that defies both science and faith. She already has. Dawn always arrives late over Westminster Abbey. The first light does not rush in but creeps, uncertain, along the buttresses and the old stained glass, brushing the saints and angels carved into stone with a trembling hand, as though it, too, fears what lies beneath. For centuries, this slow morning ritual has repeated itself, sunlight meeting shadow, holiness meeting rot, and beneath it all, the dead remain, unbothered by prayer or time. Among them, Elizabeth I still lies encased in her leaden prison, her silent reign continuing in the dark. She has outlasted every king and empire that followed her, not through triumph, but through stubbornness, through the physical defiance of her tomb, refusing to surrender to dust. Yet ever defiance corrodes, even lead weeps. And now, 4 centuries later, the monument that once promised immortality has become a perfect allegory for her own deception, eternal from above, decaying from within. By the 20th century, the Abbey had become more museum than church. Its echo filled not with chants of monks, but with the whispers of tourists. Cameras flashed where once candles burned, and the footsteps of thousands traced the same paths once reserved for kings. Yet beneath all that bustle, nothing had changed. The air still trembled faintly over the spot where the two sisters lay. The Abbey's caretakers continued to note, in their quiet reports, the same strange patterns, the floor above the vault settling by a fraction of an inch each decade, faint moisture rising through the cracks after heavy rain, the soft metallic tang that sometimes haunted the air. None of them dared to call it what it was, the slow breath of corruption still escaping from the tomb of England's greatest queen. They preferred to blame it on the pipes, or the weather, or the peculiar way the Abbey held air. But those who stayed long enough, who felt the vibration beneath their feet when the bells rang, knew it was something else. The Abbey itself had become an organism of memory, and the tomb of Elizabeth, its throbbing heart, the lead that encased her was not merely metal, it was a kind of skin, sweating and swelling, responding to the rhythm of the world above. The faint warmth of candles, the thunder of trains beneath London, the pulse of tourists' footsteps, all of it found its way downward, stirring the stillness, The coffins of Elizabeth and Mary shifted imperceptibly in their shared grave, pressing against each other like old enemies, locked in endless struggle. Every vibration, every tremor, every prayer that echoed through the abbey became part of their dialogue, silent and ceaseless. Above them, marble angels watched in frozen pity. Below them, history decomposed. And yet, as strange as it sounds, her presence in that place remains unmistakable. It is not the ghost of Elizabeth that lingers, but her influence, the weight of her will. She ruled her court through fear, fascination, and contradiction, weaving power and performance into something immortal. She turned her own image into religion, her solitude into myth, her silence into strategy. And now, her tomb is a perfect mirror of her reign, majestic on the surface. Haunted beneath, her effigy lies above, carved from flawless marble, her eyes lifted toward heaven, her lips caught in a faint, eternal calm. But below that tranquil mask, the lead coffin still holds the shape of a woman in torment, the faint contours of ribs, the hollow of a throat, the indentation where hands once folded across her chest. It is as if her struggle to appear divine was pressed into the very metal that holds her. Some nights, when storms roll over London and lightning flashes through the high stained glass, the abbey fills with a strange illumination, not bright, but spectral, as though the air itself remembers fire. Those who have been there at such hours claim that for a heartbeat the marble figures seem to flicker, and that Elizabeth's statue looks almost alive, her eyes gleaming as if watching the world she left behind. The illusion fades as quickly as it comes, leaving only the echo of thunder and the faint smell of ozone. But it is enough to remind anyone who witnesses it that the dead are never entirely gone from this place. They linger, not as spirits, but as memory condensed into stone and air. In truth, the abbey's beauty depends on that illusion. It survives on the thin veil between reverence and horror, between sacred light and the knowledge of what festers beneath. The marble above does not deny the decay below, it sanctifies it. The abbey's holiness is built upon that contradiction. The way a candle's flame exists only because darkness surrounds it. Elizabeth's monument, with its serene effigy and silent vault, embodies that paradox more perfectly than any other. She was a queen who understood masks better than anyone, and even now, centuries later, her final disguise remains intact. The faithful kneel before her monument and see only eternity. Not the sweating lead, not the pressure of gas, not the black water that may still pool between the coffins. The Victorians, with their morbid curiosity, had turned royal corpses into artifacts. But the modern world, in its obsession with preservation, has made something even stranger: a cult of denial. The abbey's staff polish her marble weekly, ensuring it gleams for cameras. The guides recite her achievements in measured tones, speaking of empire and glory and poetry, never of flesh. In doing so, they have become her last courtiers, still tending the illusion she began. But occasionally, when the tourists are gone and the lights are dimmed, one of those same guides will linger a moment longer beside her effigy. They might reach out and touch the cold marble, feeling the faintest tremor beneath, not of life, but of memory still moving. And if they are honest with themselves, they will sense it, the quiet pulse of something deep below, the restless rhythm of time itself, reclaiming what was stolen. For even the most perfect monument is mortal. Stone erodes, lead softens, air corrodes all that it touches. One day, perhaps a century from now, the abbey will face another restoration, and someone will once again open that vault. They will find what Dean Stanley feared to write, not a preserved relic, but the aftermath of transformation, The lead may have collapsed into itself, folding the two coffins into one twisted shape. The bones may have fused. Indistinguishable. Elizabeth and Mary joined forever in a grotesque parody of reconciliation. And the air, trapped for half a millennium, will rush out again, with the force of prophecy a sigh of centuries, a breath of death, a reminder that even queens cannot control how they are remembered. But even that image, that final vision of ruin, is not the end. For the true haunting of Elizabeth's tomb lies not beneath the stone, but in the minds of those who imagine it. Every century remakes her in its own image. The Victorians saw her as purity and power, the embodiment of empire. The modern age sees her as enigma and myth, the first woman to command the world, and the future, perhaps, will see her as something else entirely, a warning, a reflection of humanity's endless war against time. For what is the Abbey, if not the world's most beautiful denial of death? And what is Elizabeth, if not its most perfect ghost, not haunting from beyond, but from within, whispering through the illusions we create to keep ourselves from facing our own decay? There is a peculiar serenity in that realization. The Abbey, for all its grandeur, is nothing more than a temple of endings. Every hymn, every prayer, every note of the organ climbs into the rafters and dissolves into the same silence that holds her. And yet, there is beauty in the way it continues, in the way people still come, century after century, to stand above her and believe in eternity for a few brief moments. They do not know they are breathing the same air that once escaped from her tomb. They do not realize that every flicker of candlelight dances on the unseen residue of centuries of decay. And perhaps it is better that they don't, for faith, like monarchy, survives best when it does not look too closely at what lies beneath. Outside, dawn has finally reached its full strength. The light pours through the high windows, painting the marble effigies in gold. The Abbey awakens once more. The tourists begin to gather. The guards unlock the gates. No one speaks of the tomb. No one thinks of the lead, or the sisters, or the sigh of centuries sleeping below their feet. The world goes on. The Queen remains. Her legend endure, as all illusion do, fed by repetition and reverence, yet somewhere deep below, in the dark womb of the Abbey, the lead still whispers, the metal still moves, the dust of two queens still mingles, and the silence still breathes. And in that silence, if the earth itself could speak, it might say the only truth that remains, that everything beautiful eventually becomes its own shadow, that even eternity has a smell, and that beneath every crown ever forged by human hands lies the same destiny, a breath, a sigh, and then nothing but the echo of the name left behind. Night falls differently over Westminster Abbey than it does anywhere else in London. The city outside hums with modern life, the pulse of engines and neon and hurried footsteps. But within those thick medieval walls, time moves as though it were liquid slow, dense, heavy with memory. The air grows colder as the tourists leave, and the last footsteps fade into the cloisters, where the echo lingers longer than sound itself. One by one, the lamps are dimmed, the great doors are locked, and silence folds over the Abbey like a shroud. It is in that stillness that history seems to awaken, not with voices or movement, but with presence, that inexplicable weight that presses down upon the living, reminding them that beneath their feet lies the sum of all the centuries that came before. There, under the same flagstones worn smooth by kings and pilgrims, Elizabeth I remains. Her coffin no longer gleams, its edges are soft, its surface warped, its inscriptions faint. The once perfect lead that encased her has turned the colour of ash and sorrow, Yet even now, it endures the last mask of a queen who never stopped performing. Not even in death. The abbey has learned to live with its ghosts. It breathes with them. The wind that drifts through the arches seems to carry whispers. Sometimes prayers, sometimes sighs, and sometimes something that sounds almost like laughter. The caretakers pretend not to hear. They go about their work with reverent indifference, sweeping, dusting, lighting candles for services that have been said a million times before. They tell themselves it is imagination when the marble seems to flicker under candlelight. When the faint scent of roses, Elizabeth's favourite, rises from nowhere in the chill of February. They speak softly, for to raise one's voice here feels like a trespass against the dead. But still, they feel her. Everyone does. The Virgin Queen is not gone. She simply lingers not as spirit, but as energy, absorbed into every molecule of air, every atom of dust, every cold beam of moonlight that glides across her effigy. Above her, the marble still lies serene, perfect, untouchable. It is her final portrait, crafted not by an artist but by ambition itself. Her sculpted eyes gaze upward toward heaven, but the expression is not one of devotion. It is calculation. It is composure. It is the same look she wore when facing Parliament, when outsmarting her council, when deceiving ambassadors who mistook her silence for grace. Even in stone, she is still in control. The sculptor captured not the tenderness of faith, but the hardness of will, a woman who mastered power by mastering her image. And in this way, the monument lies twice, once about her piety, and once about her peace, for there is no peace beneath that calm. Beneath the marble lies the coffin, and beneath the coffin lies the truth that power, when buried, does not rest. It festers, it corrodes, it whispers to those who dare to listen. The centuries since her death have not diminished her. They have made her more unreal, more myth than memory. Historians argue about her triumphs and her cruelties, her loves and her lies. But no one can touch her now. The woman is gone, but the symbol remains, a ghost that Britain still worships without knowing why. Her reign has become a golden mirror in which the nation sees what it wishes to see: glory, discipline, purpose. But mirrors, like coffins, eventually crack. The truth of her body decayed, compressed, fused into her sisters undermines the illusion. The truth of her story: loneliness, fear, the desperate hunger for control, erodes the marble like acid. Every candle lit in her honor casts a shadow that reaches down to the vault below, where the real Elizabeth sleeps in her leaden womb, unmoved by prayer, untouched by pity. There are moments, rare but undeniable, when the abbey feels almost alive in a way that defies explanation. The sound of bells rippling through the night sets the stone trembling. The ancient pipes of the organ release a vibration so deep it reaches into the floor itself, echoing through the soil, through the vaults, through the coffins. Those who have stood in the chapel at such times describe a strange sensation, as though the abbey were exhaling, as though something beneath were stirring. Slow but deliberate. Perhaps it is only the resonance of the music. Perhaps it is the shifting of the ground. Or perhaps it is the breath of those who have lain too long in silence. The vibration rolls through the abbey like a pulse, and for a brief, fragile instant, the line between life and death feels thinner than air. It is easy to forget that Elizabeth once feared this very moment, the stillness, the dark, the surrender to time. She had lived her life with the certainty that to pause was to perish. She stood for 15 hours on that final day, refusing the bed, refusing the inevitable, as if sheer will could hold the body together. But time is a patient hunter. It does not chase. It waits. It waited for her in the long corridors of Richmond Palace, in the folds of her gowns, in the very powder she painted onto her skin. It followed her into the coffin, sealed itself inside with her, and has been working ever since, turning flesh to vapor, pride to sediment, empire to echo. Time, it seems, is the only monarch who never dies. And yet, even as it destroys, it remembers. Every atom of her still exists somewhere, dispersed into the air, woven into the dust, carried by the hands of tourists who brush against her stone without knowing it. The same sunlight that warms her monument once fell upon her face when she stood before her court. The same raindrops that darken the abbey roof have fallen through cycles of centuries upon her grave, soaked through the earth, touched the lead, and risen again to the clouds. She is not gone. She has become part of everything. Her decomposition is her immortality. The Virgin Queen, who refused all unions in life, has at last married the world in death. But what a cruel marriage it is, not of love, but of surrender. For even as her atoms scatter, her image endures, reshaped by every generation that needs her. The poets of the 17th century made her divine. The Victorians made her pure. The moderns make her tragic. Each version buries her deeper beneath the stories told in her name. Perhaps this is her final punishment: to be remembered too much, to be rewritten forever, to be worshipped as something she never was. Even her tomb participates in this deception. Marble saint above, rotting woman below. It is the perfect metaphor for power itself, for how every empire conceals its decay beneath a mask of grace. And what of her sister, the forgotten Mary, lying crushed beneath her? If ghosts dream, then perhaps Mary's dreams are quieter, filled not with glory but with resignation. Her coffin, smaller and humbler, has long since lost its shape. The pressure of Elizabeth's weight has bent it, splintered it, erased the difference between them. Their bones, if any remain, mingle now in the black sludge that fills the space between. The Catholic and the Protestant, the sinner and the saint, the two halves of England's divided soul, pressed together at last until neither can be told apart. In death, they achieved what life denied them: unity, a grotesque, eternal reconciliation. And somewhere above them, marble angels look down and smile, as though this were mercy. The Abbey, in its infinite patience, will keep this secret until the end. Long after the last choir has sung, long after London's skyline has crumbled, long after language itself has changed beyond recognition, the lead will remain, heavy and dark, buried beneath layers of history. It will corrode, it will collapse, but even as it does, it will whisper. The sound will be faint, a hiss of gas, a sigh of pressure, a murmur of metal, but it will speak. And what it will say is what all graves say, in their own quiet way, that no one escapes the law of return. That beauty ends where the flesh begins. That power, like perfume, cannot mask the scent of what it hides. And yet, paradoxically, there is peace in that thought, because decay is not the opposite of life, it is its continuation. The Abbey understands this. Even if the living do not, the candles burn down, the wax melts into the floor, the smoke rises and joins the same air that fills the tombs below. The prayers uttered for the dead dissolve into sound waves that fade but never vanish. Everything transforms, nothing disappears. Perhaps Elizabeth, if she still exists in some spectral awareness, has come to accept this. Perhaps the silence she once feared has become her truest crown. the only one that cannot be taken. The only one that does not glitter, but endures. And so, as night deepens, and the city outside forgets her again, the abbey keeps its vigil. The moonlight spills across the marble like spilled milk, cold and pure, and for a fleeting moment it seems to animate her effigy, the white face gleaming, the lips trembling as though about to speak. But she says nothing. She does not need to. The whole building speaks for her now. The whisper of stone, the slow rhythm of age, the pulse beneath the floor, all of it tells her story more truthfully than words ever could. She is gone, yet she remains. She is silent, yet she speaks. She is dust, yet she is legend. And perhaps that is the final triumph of Elizabeth I, not that she conquered nations, or defied kings, or built an empire, but that even in death, she became what she always wanted to be, indivisible from history itself, forever reigning in the space between truth and illusion, beauty and decay, life and the endless dark.